these seminars, which have now become weekly since last week. This time we are very pleased to see Breno talk about green operations. So over to you, Breno. And the usual way, if anybody has any questions as we go along, please use the chat. Okay.
Yeah, thanks, Emmanuel. Is it 30 minutes that I have, or 40?
We usually go for the full hour, but we said we stop after 35 minutes or so and allow some time for discussion.
Okay, I have a timer here for me then. Thank you.
Okay.
Well, thanks, Emmanuel. Thanks, everybody, for attending this seminar. If I do experience any problems with audio, just give me a shout, and then I will turn off my camera. Well, what I'm going to present today, it is entitled Building a Green Operation Strategy Through Engaged Scholarship. But in fact, as you probably saw in Emmanuel's email, there are two elements of it. So because I'm doing engaged scholarship using a new concept, which I defined as sustainability fitness, I will have part one for this presentation, which is setting up the scene for how I came up with this concept, on how it's structured and what are the theoretical underpins behind it. But then I will quickly move, hopefully quickly, to the empirical work, to the preliminary empirical work that tests these concepts and examine the effectiveness of doing it through engaged scholarship. So nothing really different here from the traditional classical agenda, you know. So let me move on just straight to what matters. So I mean, let me just start by saying that a number of authors have been bringing up the difficulties in translating sustainable development and sustainability into practice. And these, it's not simply just for us in the business schools. These refers to different levels of management. So this refers to national policies, to urban planners, then of course the management and engineering that work very closely to companies, but also at personal lifestyle level. So this is probably a result of the way that the concepts have been designed, that embeds intrinsic complexity and uncertainty around the way we define sustainable development. But for those who are not familiar with the concept started back in 87, and it's very simple and elegantly says that sustainable development is the type of development that meets the needs of the current generation without compromising the needs of future generations. Okay, there is a number of derived definitions from that to include all the species, to talk about well-being, but in the end of the day, they always face a number of problems when are being translated into practice. And part of that is because you know, in both academia and practice, there is a kind of a tendency to move from the absolute measures of sustainability to relative measures. So if you are, let's say, talking about a water pollution, you know, there is, I mean, the concept of pollution itself is simply a level of concentration of a pollutant, a substance that is exogenous to that environment that can create harm to that environment. So if you cross that level, then you have pollution. So it's related to concentration. But then when you move to public policy, for instance, or urban planning, then we start talking about levels of pollution per capita, or in factories, we will certainly be talking about per measure of output. And then this has been kind of almost a rule for the past 30 years or so. But what we've been seeing in both practice and theory now is it is a requirement to start adopting absolute reductions. So going through measuring what is the absolute emissions of pollutants, of waste, seems to be the direction that we are seeing both practice and theory. Some of this has already been established as norm in some industries. So, for instance, you can think of the food industry, for instance. There is a number of manufacturers that will label their product free from pesticides or organic. In terms of investment criteria, there is also a number of guidance from the environmental and social governance guides and Dow Jones Sustainability Index that will exclude some industries because they are not aligned with values. So it's usually kind of a via negative or adoption of thresholds. So the fishing industry, there is a fishing quota and so on. These when this is done at planet level, if you want, it can create it can lead to international agreements, and these international agreements will tend to influence countries' environmental policies, which in itself will impact on the way the organizations design and develop their environmental policy strategies. Finally, that could cascade all the way down to the individual values and behavior. You can also have someone like Greta Thunberg over here trying to change things in her individual behavior and trying to influence others' behavior, which can then lead to changes in organizations, which can change in the way countries design their environmental policies. And then finally, these can be set as an example to sign wider international agreements. For instance, if a bill is passed as for urban air pollution in California, that could actually have an impact on manufacturers here in Europe and in the UK. So as I said, there is a number of things happening at global level, but it is quite critical on how these impact on as an input for operations and sustainability strategy of companies. So if we start with, Paris Agreement, of course, this is kind of almost unidimensional type of policy. It's about carbon, or it's about greenhouse gases, and then countries kind of set up their own goals, and then that cascaded to industries, which eventually could lead to legislation or city council local limits for organizations where they operate. All the initiatives, I mean, you can see that 3 of them here are related to the United Nations, are far more complex. So the establishment of sustainable development goals, brings a multidimensional view of sustainability. And it includes, of course, climate issues as the Sustainable Development Goal number 13, but it goes all the way to poverty, and it is, and then what is happening in both country and city level is that politicians and communities have difficulties in trying to prioritize some of these goals. So if we think of the relationship between how organizations operate and how they want to support the advancement of these goals, it is also problematic because it will require some level of prioritization. The Inclusive Wealth Report also it tries to expand the wealth of countries from simply looking at GDP to look at 3 types of capital, and I will talk about that in another slide. But one of the most controversial suggestions of policies come from planetary boundaries, which is this one here in the right. In the right side, in the down right side here. Okay, so these one over here, it's called the planetary boundaries, and the idea is that we set up limits for anthropogenic activity. So we need to kind of think, what are the limits for economic activity, for human presence in some areas, and how they are impacting the different aspects of the environment, the oceans, the land, the air, and so on, and other species, biodiversity loss, for instance. So these type of thing can, if being proved, and again, it's largely controversial, because in the same way we've seen how now with the COVID pandemic, if you set up lockdown measures and they are too strict, the damage on the economic activity is just too high. So if you set up one of these boundaries here too tight, you're going to disable the mechanisms to take people out of poverty. You're going to disable mechanisms to give better well-being. But if they are too loose, they may create irreversible damage on the environment. So that's where the controversy is behind some of these tools. I said this is the Inclusive Wealth Report, and what they are doing is looking at the level of wealth that countries have in terms of the natural capital, produced capital, and human capital. Natural capital would be your oil reserves. It could be, forests, anything that is related to ecological, or ecosystem services. The produced capital, it is more related to the manufactured capital that we have, roads, infrastructure, and so on. And then finally, human capital, it is the soft side of nations, their level of education, trust, culture, and so on. I mean, again, it's largely done by economists, trying to monetize the wealth of some of these tangible issues, but other ones are highly intangible assets that nations have. So from what you've seen in the previous slides, you probably can guess now that my work, my research, which perhaps during my PhD and in my latest publications, they are most really related to these two over here. They are very much, because of my background in industrial engineering, they are very much on the operations function, but given the frustration in explaining what is going on in reality with organizations, I had to migrate and start looking at wider systems. So I started looking at socio-ecological systems. That's where the publication in 2016 on measuring sustainability fitness of socio-ecological systems comes about. It's a result of my curiosity at this level over here in reading the work that is outside the operations management community. It is quite daunting to see on how these publications kind of build up the theories on what kind of data they use, on how they articulate the use of thresholds at this level. And then when you go into environmental strategy or sustainable business model, you can see that these started just back in 2013 Academy of Management paper, by Whiteman. But all the predecessors in the area of environmental strategy were very hesitant in suggesting the adoption of thresholds. What we have been seeing lately by Hoffman is, in fact, rather than thresholds, talking about roles. Okay, so how does your organization play a role to build up, to conserve, to preserve natural capital, social capital, or to enhance produced capital? Yeah, so I think, from the operation strategy perspective, I'm very much trying to look at the strategic decisions, of course, that are related to location, capacity, supply network, process technology, development, organization, and the trade-offs when one is making decisions that should favor sustainability or carries sustainability values. So by now you might be, in a situation that you probably understand on how these things are happening in the sustainability field, in the sustainable operations field, but still conceptualizing sustainability, it is far from simply getting some measures about your emissions and simply laying down into a number that you can say whether you're sustainable or not. It feels more like, me going back home and saying to my wife that I'm tired, and then she says, why are you tired? I say, well, on the way back home, I just run behind a bus and saved £2 40 pence. I said, well, you're such an idiot. You should have run behind a cab and saved £15, right? So why we don't decide whether we running behind a cab or running behind a tax or a bus? It continues very, very hard to define what is a sustainable company and what is unsustainable. Perhaps telling what is unsustainable, it's easy, but telling what is sustainable, it's still quite hard. Evidence of that, we can see that companies that so past was called sustainable or sustainability pioneers by very strongly in academic publication and by in the wider medium. you know Better Place, for instance, is a company that created a battery swap systems for cars, and it went bust. Think City is a Norwegian company that provided sustainable mobility solutions. That's on how they defined themselves, and they went bust. Uh, Vectrix, Vectrix was a company that went even probably beyond trying to use globalization as their sources to sustain a sustainability value. So they were manufacturing Poland to reduce manufacturing costs, but they still went bust. So there is something missing in our understanding of sustainability, that even companies that we class them as sustainable companies, they are going bust, and other companies that they're still surviving. And perhaps the reason for that is that we are taking the sustainable development concept just from the external aspects of it, and then trying to ask organizations to follow it without looking at their own needs. I mean, one of the very first things is that the sustainable development company or sustainable development concept, it refers primarily of essential needs. Okay, so that's one of the key things about the concept in the original document. They are also talking about the avoidance of ecological crisis, and then they are also saying that we need limits, although not absolute limits, because these need to be looked at in terms of the level of technology we have, in terms of the availability of resources and social organization, but they are talking about limits as well. So it was based on that, by revisiting the original documents created by the United Nations and the World Council for Economic Development, that I came up with the systems fitness, which I call now sustainability fitness. So basically, this is an indicator of how far a system is from collapse. So you can use that for a city, for a nation, for a company. You can even think about that at product level if you want. But the whole idea is that a system should have the ability or develop the ability to remain healthy while consuming the available resource, and as a result avoid the collapse of ecological resources, social relationships, and economic activities. If we see on how the theoretical side of this has evolved over time, we'll see that primarily the previous works on sustainability performance, they were not concerned about avoidance of collapse. They were concerned about a calculation of equilibrium, of giving the same way to the 3 dimensions of sustainability. And as a result, what they had was an area of collapse which was probably which needed to be expanded. So what I've done there was that we created a new way of looking at sustainability performance, which expands the area of collapse, and it is linked not just with something that is tangible, which is the availability and surplus of resources, which the literature was already covering, but also combining it with something which is subjective, which is the balance of essentiality. So this variable over here refers to how balanced you are in terms of meeting the needs of the system. If you are 1, you are perfect balance. So you have a nice ratio between essential stuff and superfluous stuff. So you have a good ratio of that. If you are around 0, that means that you are just consuming superfluous stuff, or you're probably consuming essential stuff. So that leads to a situation of constant stress for survival, or here a dysfunctional system. The further modeling that we have in mind to instruct the development of environmental strategy or green operation strategy, if you want, it is through the evaluation of the different baskets of consumption that one will have in the system. So the previous literature will also look at this as homogeneous baskets of consumption, and what we've done was to start looking at this as 4 different baskets of consumption that combine essential essential or high essentiality and high impact, low essentiality, low impact, or superfluous in this case, and essential, high essentiality, low impact, and then superfluous, high impact. Okay, so by looking at on how systems consume different resources and how the consumption of the resource actually meet the needs or meet the wants of a system, we can start thinking of on what the corporate response should be like. As I said, we can do that at a product level as well. We can think of an organization. We can look at the portfolio of products they have, how that's split in terms of essential products and superfluous products. We can look at the production regime and how production processes, for instance, they also address some essential needs such as jobs. So all of that can come into place when you're doing a sustainability analysis and the formulation of sustainability strategy of organization. Please bear in mind that I'm using these terms interchangeably here: sustainable operation strategy, sustainability strategy, environmental strategy. They are pretty much the same because I'm using a systems view in my research, and then the wider sphere that we have is the environment. So anytime that I speak about environmental strategy, it is in fact a sustainability strategy. But just think about, a company that produces just Bentleys. It's highly, it would potentially be judged as highly superfluous products, but the production processes are quite essential for the city of Crewe. So as soon as you change the hierarchy level, or you look at the of processes rather than the products, your the analysis of sustainability would also change. So as I said, you can do that at product level, and this is one of the papers that I'm currently writing. So I welcome feedbacks in feedback on this. We look at the critical resources, so we're not trying to solve everything in the system. We prioritize what the resources that need to be taken care of, measure the resource consumption, and then evaluate, measure the product environmental impact. Of course, this needs to be done considering the time dimension, But as soon as you have that, you're supposed to be able to have a product sustainability fitness, which in our view could be more robust than other measures that are currently used just to evaluate product environmental impact. For instance, a methodology such as the life cycle analysis uh, tend not to have massive consideration of products essentiality. So we've done that for electronics. So I've collected data in the UK and in Brazil a couple of years ago. Let's say that you are in a country where they need to control the manufacturing CO2, and then the production is primarily for domestic consumption. So you can look at on how essentiality values were deployed, and in mobile phones, it's considered the most essential of all of items after that is just laptops, and on how intensive in terms of CO2 emissions the manufacturing process is. So by doing that, you would say, if I'm struggling here with CO2 emissions and I need to cut the production or the consumption of some of these products, I would probably cut, the tablets and the PCs rather than just trying to make incremental changes in all of this. So very similar to what is happening in a moment of crisis now with the COVID as well. But as soon as I change the national context, you can see that tablets are not as essential as they are in the UK, in Brazil. You can see that all the others, they are fairly similar. And for the sake of the illustration here, we kept the CO2 intensity. But you can see here that it would be a much easier a decision to cut down tablet emissions if you need a drastic change in the face of a crisis than trying to just go through the hardest work of trying to get incremental improvements in other areas. At corporate level, things are far more complex, and one of the ways we're trying to model this and to instruct the development of or the design of a sustainability strategy is through understanding that the sustainability fitness of the organization will be a function of the respect they have for environmental limits, and that in a robust national environment, that could be the legislation itself, and the alignment of needs. So the alignment of needs will be the needs of the firm and the needs of society. But again, some firms are largely local in terms of their activities. Other firms are largely global, and then the weights between these two areas of scope, if you want, geographical scope of the organization, needs to be considered when further modeling will be designed. So, of course, this is a strategy exercise. So we need to have the time dimension, and we need to start thinking about tomorrow's needs, not just the needs of today. And the whole process on how you're gonna travel from here all the way there. Whether you're gonna have. So this is not just about the financial health of the organization. But instead, it is a more holistic analysis on how the company is able to survive throughout time and also in the face of potential crisis. Yeah, I have already spoken about the respect for environmental limits when I explained the framework in the slide before. But one thing that I want to stress here again is this idea that we have a terminology to call things sustainable or unsustainable. Even in my job title, it's sustainable operations management, and in the conference tracks that we go in Aroma, it's sustainable operations management. But that straight away can lead one to infer that there is something that it is just binary. You either sustainable or unsustainable. But this is very hard to be proven empirically. And what we're doing with the sustainability fitness concept is that our understanding of sustainability, it is more like, the competitiveness, concept. So there are elements that are related to external environment that needs to be in consideration. And unfortunately, the literature very, very rarely will consider external aspects as part of the sustainability of the organization. And here we're trying to do that. So the sustainable operation strategy, the definition of that, again, it needs to be something related to space and time dimension, and it is a plan to position the company in the long term that it is able to respond to environmental and social pressures, and then of course it needs to respect the environmental limits. So if there is a call to burn a substance in their products or process, they need to be able to do so, and they need to create some socio-economic value in order to be aligned with what is needed by society, and to support the survival of the firm. So let me move now to the empirical part of the research. As I said, what we're doing here, it is based on two macro variables, essentiality and environmental impact. From an ontological point of view, essentiality is largely subjective, but environmental impact, it is largely objective. It may not match accurately to the environmental legislations that we have, but there is an altered reality there that in the end of the day going to catch you whether you're measuring it or not. And what we've done was, I think Prajanta is there. Thanks to Prajanta and to John in the low carbon, I was invited to help out the Birmingham Botanical Gardens, and we did a series of 3 workshops with them to increase environmental strategy awareness, to define what the drivers for the environmental strategy was, an environmental SWOT, an analysis of their products and identification of stakeholders, and then environmental policy formulation. And then COVID kicked off, and then we couldn't do anything else. So all the data has been transcribed, and then it's currently being analyzed with thematic analysis and the observations and notes that I had from the field. As I said, I will not spend time on this, but for those who are interested, I think this slide is going to be made available after the seminar. I'm using Anders van der Ven, engaged scholarship, and we did follow that quite prescriptively. So we let the organization to participate in terms of the problem formulation, and then from that we discuss with them the research design, and the next step is to do the problem solving, and then we're going to contrast with the theory building around sustainability fitness that was done at the socio-ecological systems level first, but at the corporate level is being done with the organization. I don't want to dwell much on the differences between action research and engaged scholarship, whether there is some controversy there, whether it's just like a new fancy name that social scientists use, and then action research is more related to engineering people and other areas of science, but it is said by the latest literature to be better in terms of complex practice that supports better theory generation, and that's the path that I'm taking on the research. For those who don't know the Botanical Gardens, they are here, just 3 minutes from where I live in Harborne. So they are in Edgbaston, and it's an 18th century construction, founded in 1829. The glass house that has been the major attraction, and it was built in 1852. and then it was all rebuilt in the 90s. So you could expect that they structure, the facilities are quite old, despite of being rather nice and pleasant. The structure are quite old, and there is a number of constraints to do any change in the buildings and in the land. For instance, during the discussion, we cannot even do an analysis of putting solar panels in the car park, because anything that blocks the view from the building is prohibited by the city council. But it gets almost 200,000 visitors per year. They consider themselves as an educational charity, so they get 17,000 school children per year, and they have more than 5,000 members. They are very concerned with energy consumption, customer satisfaction, and their environmental reputation. So because they are an educational charity, related to environmental issues, they have gone through. They're quite concerned about their facilities, the state of their facilities, and the environmental performance. And one of the things they've done in the past years were to move from using a gas boiler to use large biomass boiler through the Renewable Heat Initiative. Interestingly, you can see on how these things were done. It was in fact a number of investors who visit their facility and saw an opportunity to get more than their interest rates, and then they made the application for them. And simple questions such as, where does the biomass come from? Where the wood pellets come from, whether these are certified wood or not, which could increase the reputational risks, are questions that could be difficult for them to answer sometimes. As I move on here, I will just present quickly the drivers, the SWOT analysis and the fitness system here that we've done for them. So they are, of course, bound by the legislation. They are quite concerned about their customers, the environmental impact in the long term, the needs of the organization. They are not plentiful when it comes to resources. They always need to be bidding for money to do some investments, and then of course the reputation. So this is what is driving them. And then you can see that when we start doing the environmental SWOT here, they were kind of concerned a lot about the use of resources and the investment cost to do the repairs. They were concerned about their past experience with biomass, their ability, the inability to properly recycle some of the things on site, the lights that they were, the lightening cost during the day, and the energy consumption during the day, and the lack of clear direction or guidance or policy to implement expensive bills. So these were kind of the areas that they were most concerned. They were also, concerned with other things that could happen with a spike in energy costs, or the public not being happy with them. Even Brexit was creating some anxiety there. The car park, something that created quite a lot of discussion during the workshops on how the customers want to expand the car park, and on contrary, what they want is to incentivize the use of public transportation to get to the gardens. So there is a lot of interesting things that emerged from the environmental SWOT analysis. Of course, they have strong values, they have a strong brand, they have a good audience, and they are already doing some green things there, like composting, greenery, soaking up CO2 due to the green areas that they have. But I want to move on. We can revisit this if you have any questions in this area. But what we've done was like, let's list what do they have in terms of products and services, on how do they see products and service there. And then when we start doing that analysis, they start moving their view of what they were about. They said, no, we are not just education, we are also entertainment. So we are what they call edutainment, uh, environmental charity. So all of a sudden, all of the things start changing. Uh, they of course sell the green and safe space, and the money they get from admissions and membership as products and services there. The entertainment, the education, the school income that was related to school income, the plant knowledge and the growth for future sustainability, and the leisure, the play, visitor experience. Uh, the way they ranked these things was like this. So the gardens, the plant knowledge and growth experience they provide, the education activities that they run for schools, the playgrounds and the toilets were considered of low impact and high essentiality. On the other hand, the glass house was considered something of high essentiality for the customers. The shop was also high essentiality for the customers. The cafe high essentiality for the customers, and that car park they put a question mark because they didn't have any analysis whatsoever. Although they were trying to make changes in the car park, they were doing it without actually understanding the needs of the stakeholders. Interestingly, what they have here was hospitality events, but it was considered essential from the corporate needs view, not as a social need. And also the seasonal events, the Christmas lights and the Halloween festival that they do, which is very energy intensive, that they rent the gardens to a third party to run these events. They were also seen as high impact, but because there was no connection whatsoever, it's not them running this, there was no connection to their educational and environmental values. These were seen of low essentiality. But as soon as we classify this, someone from finance gives a shout and says, listen, we always have a spike of membership after these events. So they started having a debate whether it was an essential activity for PR and finance, and whether rather than trying to change this, they could actually start linking this to their values. So they would bring up the seasonal events to a higher level of essentiality by perhaps bringing themes such as climate change during the Christmas lights, or bringing up, issues about the Amazon, or the tropical forest during the Halloween and so on. They also wanted to deal with the glass house by changing the energy, the kind of energy they were consuming, to reduce the impact of the glass house, because they see as an icon, they see as something that relates to their and it's highly related to their purpose, and it's in the interest that the kids and the visitors know the flora from other countries. And then finally, the car park, which were they considering on how they could reduce perhaps the car park, or put an electric charger. But again, something done without the consultation of stakeholders to actually understand what's the need. So for instance, during the workshop, I asked a simple question like, are there loads of families or moms with little kids, babies coming, that they prefer to drive rather than taking the bus, or elderly people who use the car? They don't have any data to support that the car park is something superfluous. It might be, people with disabilities, for instance, they were unable to actually point out that link to the needs of to the mobility needs of people in relation to the need of car park. Well, my final considerations here, we've noticed that the participants found the concept of essentiality quite useful, because it pushing them to contrast what they actually need to survive and what society values as an essential need. They also, you know, they also find quite valuable. I gave them loads of frameworks for them to use, and then they end up having a more meaningful discussion around these metrics than the other things, such as the Sustainable Development Goals, and there is research already showing that Sustainable Development Goals, it's difficult to use when formulating environmental strategy at firms, but interestingly, because it's a small organization, it was very difficult to get accurate or data on environmental impacts.
Breno,
yes.
Sorry to, can I just see, I don't know how much longer you have. I was just trying to see if you can try and round up so that we can have a few minutes of discussion.
Yeah, I just have 3 or 4 more slides. Okay. Yeah. So just to wrap this up here, we know that by doing these exercise for an organization that doesn't have resources to run the traditional environmental impact assessment, it was quite useful because they could start seeing what they could remove completely, or what, on how they could prioritize and understand the implications of their actions. And as I move on, I think this is pretty much, I think engaged scholarship was also seen quite valuable, because these organizations, they have limitations in terms of hiring consultants and doing these expensive work of environmental impact assessment, analysis of external environment, and so on. What is next here? I think I will not go through this with very much detail, but it is a slide here for us to discuss later if needed. It is on how just a health crisis has kicked off a number of actions, quick actions, in fact, even in the terminologies, calling things essential businesses and services. We can discuss later on how essential items were seen in different countries, like for instance India and South Africa were very quick to remove alcohol from supermarkets. In the UK, that was not the case, and what was happening was that the supermarkets was juggling around the products they had to open space on the shelves for what is considered essential items. Amazon delaying the prime deliveries, and then sending a message, we're taking care of essential items first. And also the narrow path that is being put now, this struggle between, the virus spread and economic recovery. And that's perhaps the place where we can start using. I've been collecting data on occupational risk for COVID and professions, because we could use them as a proxy for some activities in organizations. You can see here some activities as well, just going to a registration, going to the library. And I found, my co-author and I, we found the data, where the data comes from, and then we start looking at it, using this as a prioritization method, and then use the data that we have in some of the products on essentiality against the risk of spreading the virus, in order to perhaps have better insights around lockdown and unlockdown policies. Well, having said that, I hope that you've noticed that all these environmental strategy and sustainability strategy journey always start by you choosing whether you want to run behind a bus or want to run behind a taxi. Thank you very much. Happy to take your questions now.
Thank you very much, Breno. Very interesting and challenging at times talk. There are some comments. One of them we had earlier on. You answered as you went further down your presentation about the fact that before you said it, we were questioning whether essentiality was a culture-based or if you like, economic development type of concept. And I think you said yes in the way that you spoke, and that came through in your presentation.
Yes.
But you
I
may like, rather than me sort of jumping in, you may like to just look down maybe from 451 perhaps, where Eliseo has a comment.
Yeah, so 51, did you say, or 31? What I can see 431, what the environment can sustain may be absolute, but essentiality could be debatable. Yes. Yeah, holidays abroad, for instance, John. John has put, I have 81 items compared in the UK and in Brazil, and holidays are considered more essential here than they are in Brazil. Holidays abroad, okay. So we have found that the economic status or the family income does not impact on essentiality. The country, the environment impact on essentiality. That's one of these things. Yeah, ethical. Yes, Elisio, ethical decisions are linked to culture, indeed. Ladies, please don't shoot the messenger. But you know what? Japanese mayor suggested as a policy that supermarkets should accept just men shopping rather than women, because women were more indecisive and would take longer and could increase the risk of spreading the virus. So you would never probably have such even a ventilation of that idea in the UK in these days, right? Donato here is asking, I wanted to ask Breno whether he thinks that the theory of engaged scholarship helping. I think it did help, Donato. Of course, I by no means I claim to be an expert. It is my first project that I'm taking from the design to data collection and analysis. I have done all the types of action research before, but not at the level of this one. And it does help a lot, because I think getting the input of the organization in the beginning and then going back to the theory to see on how these two could be related, I think it just increases the robustness of producing something that can create impact. Maslow, Luciano here is talking about Maslow hierarchy of needs also received the same creative culture as relative. Yes. What I want to highlight here is that we use Maslow as a starting point. Max Fried's theory as well has influenced what we say, but differently from being prescriptive and saying what is essential or not, we are simply collecting the views, the perception of what is essential and what is not. So we are allowing the system to tell. And of course, if you are living in the UK, heating systems are pretty much essential. But if you live in Brazil, in Natal, heating systems, or in Dubai, heating systems are not essential, right? So these could be a very simple, but when you go to other types of the extremes are easy to be, the extremes are very easy to be spotted. But what happened in the middle, such as the shift of tablets, I mean, the BBC run a survey 20 years ago about how essential things were, and the mobile phone was just 7%. Just 7% of the population thought a mobile phone was essential. In our survey in 2014, 97% of the people thought it was essential. Yeah, recording will be available on Teams. Is there any questions? Anyone wants to speak up? We are not good at forcing long-term effects, microplastics. Yes, John, absolutely. In a talk I delivered in Mumbai a few months, a year ago, I was talking about on the innovation and on how innovation perhaps needs to be thinking about emerging pollutants. This is a new area to be investigated. So nano pollution, it is a big problem for nano manufacturing, for instance, but it seems to attract very little attention because people are so excited about nano manufacturing, nano materials, then they forget about these other areas. At least you're saying one challenge with impact is that measurement may have different aims. For environmental impact, you might try to reduce impact, but for social impact, you might and you might prefer to increase the impact. Yes, Alicia. I think in addition to that, I think there is too much attention for the trade-offs between the dimensions, but not intradimensional trade-offs. So, for instance, you may find an excellent solution for the climate, but that may mean high consumption of water. So all of this needs to be seen. Parallel between traditional, that's a manual parallel traditional cost-benefit analysis and essentiality impact analysis. This is a hard one, perhaps, because
maybe can clarify what I was thinking.
Yeah.
I mean, when you do a cost-benefit analysis, usually for a project, you say, well, this is what's going to cost me. There are various factors that cost you, but of course, you're doing the project in order to get certain benefits, and then you compare the benefits with the costs. And you have a similar sort of situation here. Your benefits, so to speak, are the essentiality, subjective as it may be, but it has various factors that are essential to greater or lesser extent on the one hand, and the impact on the environment is the cost you suffer. Again, there are various impacts and cost you.
No. I think perhaps it was not that clear in the presentation. The distance between the collapse zone in the resource supply is what the impact is. Okay, so if you have a fish stock and then you go there and the ratio of regeneration of the stock, it's 1 ton per day, and then you always fish half a ton, you're safe, right? You can even increase that, and then the impact will not be much higher if you want. When you do at product level, of course, you can do that, but if you're doing at the social ecological level, just what you would see is how essential is fish in your diet, let's say, and how much fish do you need and how much the fish stock provides you.
Yes, but exactly, it's still the impact, even in the way you described it, is just one level removed from what is causing the impact. The fish ultimately is sustainable or not, because a certain amount of them are needed in order to regenerate. Now, of course, the impact that you calculate is, oh, we have a lot of fish, a lot of sardines, so no problem. You can eat as much as you like, but not so many cod, so you can't eat as much as you like. But ultimately, all of these stem from a certain tolerance, if you like, or certain ability, certain supply. How shall I put it? There is a cost to the planet ultimately from sustainable. At the end of the day, that's where it all stems from, as a starting point.
Yeah, I would agree with that. If your understanding of benefit is based on that, and let's also remember that there is a social learning element taking place in that. So let's say that I've said that water or veggies are not essential for me, for my nutrition. I will learn very quick that they are, because I've made a mistake in something that is, let's say, intrinsically essential for human survival. If I make a mistake in understanding how essential, let's say, flour is, then that's a different story, because that could vary across time. So this is a different, we're talking about a different variable from demand.
We're on a tangent. We'll have to talk out of line. We're on a tangent in terms of what I was thinking.
Yeah, yeah,
Okay.
but the only point I was making here, if you think benefit as benefit to meet your essential needs, yes, okay,
I
because
agree with you on benefit.
that's
I agree
that's
with
what.
you on benefit. It's the cost, the impact that I think we have a different concept of at the moment, but we can iron it out.
Yeah,
After some time.
we should talk that about that later. Emmanuel's question is part one for me. Who is the beneficiary or victim of the impact? Yes, John, there is a literature on environmental justice in these areas. You know, usually victims of the impact are quite not listen up. And then I agree with you. The the way we're trying to look at this is by expanding the framework to consider both local and global. So let's say that, you know, uh, at my weekly shopping, I'll try to simplify this, and I hope not making the wrong analogy. But I decided to buy bananas from, you know, a closer place to reduce the carbon input, but rather than the bananas from Santa Lucia. But when I do that, I'm just giving, perhaps transferring money and wealth to someone who has a large plantation rather than supporting uh, uh, subsistence agriculture in Santa Lucia. You know, so if I do that, I would need to go all the way from a consumer perspective. That's quite hard, the level of information required to make that decision. But from an organizational perspective, perhaps there is more resources to understand what the impacts are in these decisions. Yeah, then there is jokes about men and women in the supermarkets, and then are there any attempts to objectively measure essentiality? Yes, that's the paper I'm trying I'm drafting to send it to IEEE. Uh, you know, it's a work I've done with Roberto Alamino, and we've taken a binary survey of 81 items. So the respondent just said whether it's essential or superfluous, and then we calculate the means, and then and the distance to the mean of the whole sample, in order to objectively say what essentiality of that item is. We controlled for gender, location, and income, and we've noticed that women like more books and chocolates than men, and men like more video games than women. So that's some of the interesting stuff. So this COVID, people made you uh, more aware of environmental issues. Neoliteracy higher. I don't know. I think we need to wait and see. We need to see on how the rebound, how the rebound effect gonna be like. It is very hard to make predictions at the moment because it depends a lot on what area, what capital will be prioritized in the recovery. If the recovery, I mean, like right now in China, the emissions are much higher than they were before. And I had actually put on my slides here some data from the COVID, just to remember, you know, on the limitations of stopping the whole economy in terms of the environmental benefits. We the global GDP contraction going to be like probably around 5%, 5.2%. The global energy demand will be contracted by only 6%. Okay, we had 20%, I think, slump on the quarter in the UK economy, just 17% on reduction in CO2 emissions. And I think it's whether environmental issues will be raised in terms of priority to the level that health issues were. For instance, there are 64,000 people die per year due to, you know, like immature deaths, right? Earlier deaths than necessary because of urban air pollution. and we don't have such a level of urgency or actions being put in place. So there are more people dying every year because of air pollution than in the whole pandemic so far. But we don't have that same level of urgency. We don't have the same action or prioritization of environmental issues to implement an environmental agenda. Any more questions? Any comments, please? I'm conscious of time. Okay. Although we started a little bit later, but I'm conscious of time.
Okay. If there isn't any more question, I would just say thank you very much on behalf of everyone. It's been a very interesting talk on a very interesting topic, an interesting approach with many questions, I think, still hanging out there about what needs to be done. So thank you, Breno, and thanks to everyone. And don't forget, we have our final research whole day event coming up next Wednesday. See you all then.
Thanks, Emmanuel, for organizing, for leading. There's not just mine, but all the seminars so far. Has been a real pleasure to do this one. Thanks for the comments and the questions, everybody.
Okay. Take care. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.